Hi, I'm David Dobson, and welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Robert Harding. Robert is a professor of social work and human services at the University of the Fraser Valley. He obtained his PhD from Simon Fraser University. His research focuses on media discourses regarding social work, poverty, and social issues in Indigenous communities. He has published several peer-reviewed papers, books, and chapters. It's a great pleasure to have you with me, Robert.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here, David, and thanks for the invitation.
To begin, Robert, would you please explain what news discourse is?
Oh, sure. I think that's a really good question because, as you know, David, in academia, the word discourse is bandied around a lot.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I hear it, I think, well, do they really know what it is? And sometimes they don't really offer a clear definition of that, or they offer a definition that's in a lot of academic language that's really hard for people to understand.
Yeah.
So news discourse, it's to give you the really basic description, it's the construction and dissemination of people and events in a variety of media. So online, old-fashioned legacy print media, radio, and basically it's any text and talk around a particular topic. So one of the definitions I gave you is a formal definition by Thune van Dyck, who's really one of the founders of critical discourse analysis. But the basic definition is it's text and talk around a certain topic or issue of all varieties. So, for example, you can also have discourses like institutional discourses.
Yes.
So at UFE, there could be an institutional discourse around internationalization. So the discourse would include meeting minutes, what people are saying at meetings, blogs, live streamed events, emails, all the text and talk around that form a discourse. And then you can analyze that discourse for certain narratives, and trends, and patterns.
So is it close to like message framing?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly, I think the word frame does apply, right? So what you see with news discourse is certain frames come about. So unlike the institutional discourse I was talking about, we're talking about, newspaper stories, readers' comments, could be, what people are saying on television news, or online in social media. All of that can form a discourse around a topic. In this case, my interest is news discourse around Indigenous issues. But yeah, and you find certain news frames emerge from that.
Okay. So how are Indigenous issues represented in news discourse? Okay.
So that's a really good question. And I'm going to obviously, in the interest of time, give you the Cole's Notes version, just broad strokes. Okay. So essentially, I think that I did a comparative study of the 1860s newspapers in British Columbia in the 1860s with the 1990s. So that was a few years back. And the surprising thing was things haven't really changed that much. Okay. So you still have colonialism on full display. You have racism. And I would say racism is largely being replaced with what I would call ethnocentrism.
Okay.
So ethnocentrism means you're not judging people as being biologically inferior, but you're saying our culture is better than yours. Okay. So coming from that perspective, so out of that, we've seen certain discourses that are long-held colonial discourses emerged, and these involve a lot of times just kind of erasing the historical context. Okay. So if you present a news story in 2023 about a treaty process, if you don't give them the backstory about how this became an issue going back many, many decades, then readers will have a really hard time understanding. And they'll say, well, why are Indigenous people in 2023 suddenly saying they need some kind of financial compensation, or they need to recover land, right? So I mean, it's really hard to understand that for a reader who doesn't have the education, because we haven't done a good job in Canada in public education, right? So not including the context, not including diverse voices in that conversation. So you might get a chief from the Assembly of First Nations who's interviewed,
Yeah.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You don't get the
Right.
same range of sources
Okay.
that you get with settler sources.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in a lot of these discourses, what you have at the base is deeply racist logics. And so you have critiques and news commentary about expensive treaty settlements,
Yeah.
residential healing
Yeah.
agreements where always the cost of these are paid up. So the narrative becomes, look at how much Indigenous people are costing us being settlers, right?
Yeah.
And then you have, a topic in the news today a lot are water and land defenders.
Right.
And they're basically very denigrated in the news. A lot of derogatory language applied to them. They're referred to as radical activists. So those are kind of some of the patterns that we see today. But again, not that different, not as different as you might think from news portrayals like over 100 years ago, back in colonial days.
Wow. Wow. So what inspired you to conduct research in this area?
Well, that's a really good question. So I don't know if your audience can see it, but I have a little map up on the screen of where I used to work in the early 1990s, just actually after we were just having a conversation about my time in New Zealand. So when I came back to New Zealand in the early 90s, I worked with the Northern Cree Nation in northern Quebec, actually on James Bay, a little town called Shasasabee.
Okay.
It was called Sasabee on James Bay.
Okay.
And this was a few years after the Cree-Naskapi Act was signed, which is a piece of legislation, provincial legislation in Quebec that essentially gave the Quebec government and big corporations access to Northern Cree land and waterways.
Wow.
And this was for the purpose of hydroelectric development, which is the biggest, it's basically the industry that drives the Quebec economy.
Right.
And so in the press at the time, actually in La Presse, one of the major French language newspapers, they published a poll saying most Quebecois people believed that Indigenous people had a higher standard of living than non-Indigenous people. And part of it was, these treaties, these kinds of agreements. Of course, the Cree got some money for this. They established Air Quebec, their own airline. And so, and those are always played up a lot in the media. Look at how much Indigenous people are costing us, right? Remember, that's kind of one of the meta narratives. And I just thought, well, it's really clear, even then, Statistics Canada maintained data that clearly showed that Indigenous people across the entire country have a lower standard of living than non-Indigenous people. So how could people of Quebec come to the conclusion that Indigenous people are living high on the hog, have a really great standard of living? So to me, the mainstream media or the corporate media, because they're all owned by huge corporations, are implicated in that. And so that kind of said to me, this is a topic worthy of further investigation.
What did you find in your research of corporate media's portrayal of petroleum industry activities affecting Indigenous territories? Okay,
so this is my most recent research in this area. And that, we looked at, I had a couple of research assistants from BSW students, and we looked at 169 opinion pieces in corporate media. So we're talking about the National Post, Globe and Mail, and so on, right? They're all owned again by huge corporations, usually multinational. In fact, so these 169 columns, invited opinion pieces and editorials were published in these huge newspapers. And the majority, I don't know if you know this, David, but the majority of newspapers, both online and print in Canada, are owned by a huge U.S. hedge fund. So hedge funds are known as the bottom feeders of the financial district, right? And so hedge fund, it's called Chatham Asset Management. So they bought Post Media, again, 106 newspapers in Canada. They bought Post Media from a couple of other U.S. hedge funds and promptly turned those 106 newspapers into clones of one another. So they centralized editorial operations. This is from the New York Times, right? So the bottom line is these corporations have the same interest. When they're in Canada, they want to create a situation where labor costs are low and where taxes are low. Well, the only way you have low taxes is less social services and less payouts to Indigenous people for reconciliation and treaty settlements and all residential school healing, all of these things that require money. their interest is to minimize all of that. Like any huge corporation, right? They want to maximize profit, reduce costs. So they also, some of these corporations also have interests in the petroleum industry, wherein the better the petroleum industry does, the better they do. So all I'm saying is there's a vested interest there. So what we found was, so we looked at news stories involving petroleum industry activities such as pipelines or oil sands development. How are those, and specifically those ones that affect Indigenous peoples or impinge on Indigenous territories? And so that's what we looked at. We looked at how Indigenous people who were opposing these were portrayed, and they were just treated horribly. A lot of derogatory language, a lot of sarcasm used to portray them. They're portrayed as radical activists, and they were characterized as a threat to law and order and as undemocratic. Now, I don't know if you'll see this on the screen, but there are some examples about how Indigenous people were denigrated in news coverage. But then we compared that with how supporters, settlers who supported these activities were portrayed in the press. Undiluted praise. They're helping Canadians by improving the economy, and that the people supporting these initiatives were actually the majority of Canadians, and they were associated with modernity, democracy, and the rule of law. So pretty stark contrast between how these two groups were portrayed. So that was one of the main findings. But also, one of the things was we also did a side study where we looked at about 50 news stories in Indigenous publications. So little publications like First Perspective, Raven's Eye. I think there were 13 we looked at. And those stories tended to provide a lot of context for these issues. So readers had an opportunity to understand. They provided some of the history, whereas corporate newspapers were far less likely to do that. So that's one finding. Secondly, the whole project of reconciliation, which is, of course, very big across Canada and big in universities, big in academia, was portrayed as a threat to corporate interests. And finally, it was all built around like a kind of what I would call an opposition, a binary opposition. And a binary opposition was a minority of radical Indigenous activists versus the best interests of the majority of Canadians, including most Indigenous people. So these commentators who were writing from ivory towers in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, and big urban centers, claimed to also kind of understand and know how Indigenous people themselves are feeling. So the narrative was, well, this is just a few radical Indigenous people. Most Indigenous peoples are in favor of them because they, like all other Canadians, they want a more robust economy. They want more jobs, right? So this was really quite ironic, because I really thought, well, these people have probably never stepped foot on a reserve, never been in Indian country, and they claim to understand how people on the ground in Indigenous country were feeling. So that's part of the narrative.
I'll ask you a last question. So as a consumer of news from media, as you see that we read this type of news, how should we respond to such news?
Well, that's a great question, David, because I'm someone who analyzes this stuff and pushes back at it, right? And that's great. And I disseminate that. But we have to do more than that. We need to kind of pair that analysis, that critical analysis, with action. So it's a really good question. And I would say there are things we can do about this kind of problematic news coverage, whether it pertains to Indigenous people, Black people, people of color. It doesn't matter, right? I mean, so, this is clearly unfair and racialized news coverage. And I would say never underestimate the power of a letter to the editor. You write a letter to the editor, you get comments on that. Of course, they publish all of this online as well as in print format. And so, that in itself, I think, can create, it's a way of trying to engage in the conversation and change its course slightly, even if it's only ever so slightly. But I also think it's really great for us to get that conversation out into the fresh air. So discuss these kinds of problematic news stories, these racialized coverage with our colleagues, like we're doing today, David.
Yes.
But you know, even on a much less formal basis, to start talking about it, to say, yeah, I saw this in the newspaper, and this is how Indigenous people and water defenders were referred to, and it's not okay. Right? So to get that conversation happening across your entire social network, ideally, try to access Indigenous news stories. Like I said, a lot of times I think the problem is Canadians just don't know the backstory. They don't know it. I believe that most Canadians, if they're presented with the full picture, all the information, that most Canadians are fair-minded. Most settlers are fair-minded. I believe that. But it doesn't matter if you're fair-minded or not if you don't have the information, right? Then you're much more easily led astray. So check out Indigenous news stories, because they do include more history and context and give you a different take. Same with alternative media in general. And we're really fortunate here in the province of British Columbia to have one of the best and most widely circulated alternative news sources available, and that's the Tyee. You will get a very different perspective in the Tyee than you'll get in the Globe and Mail. Or in the National Post. So check it out. It's easily accessible. It's online. It doesn't cost anything. And there's many other alternative news sources as well. And then utilize social media to retweet and share Indigenous and alternative news stories in social media. So, you know, if you come across something really interesting in the Indigenous press or in an alternative news source, circulate it among your social network. Then, of course, you can always file a complaint with the newspaper. You can still do that. They have to take those seriously. I'm not saying that something will happen immediately, but file a complaint, especially in the more egregious cases. Same with, we have something called the Canadian National News Media Council, which is a self-regulatory body of the newspaper industry. So file a complaint there, especially because there is one criteria that reads, does the story contain racism, sexism, or bias against a social, religious, or political group? So, I mean, those are some practical suggestions, but I think the main point is we can't just ignore it. We can't just say, well, I don't agree with that, or it's a bit disturbing, or it bothers me a bit. I think we need to go further than that. We need to try to engage in the conversation. That's what I think we need to do, as in our case as academics, but just in general as members of the public, as an active what I would call active citizenship.
Right. Thank you very much, and great advice. Thank you for your time, Robert.
Thank you, David. And again, I really appreciate you having me on, not because it gives my research a platform, but because these are really important issues that Canadians need to be aware of, and to, as I said, take some action to change the course of the conversation that we're having now.
Thank you once again.
All right. Thanks.